Hi there, I'm Richard England, Vicar of Crofton Parish, and welcome to our Tuesday night Bible study. We are continuing our Encounter teaching series. We have been journeying through some of the early chapters in Luke's Gospel, looking at the stories of people as they encounter Jesus, what they learn about Jesus, what they learn about themselves, what they learn about what it means to be truly human within the love and grace of God. And this week we're going to think about what it means to encounter evidence that Jesus really is who he says he is. If you were watching Church at Home on Sunday, then you will know some of what we're going to be thinking about in our Tuesday night Bible study this week. But before we begin, I wanted to explain to you why having what they call an evidential basis for faith, why thinking about evidence for faith is so important at this moment. You see, as you've heard me say a number of times, we live in a strange time in history where our worldview, particularly in the West, in the UK, has separated out the physical, material world from the spiritual, supernatural world. And the assumption that lies underneath that is that we can know scientific evidence for the nature of the physical world, but the reality of the spiritual, supernatural world we have no evidence for. It is simply a matter of faith. You believe one set of things about the spiritual world. You're a Christian, you believe a certain set of things, or you're not a Christian, you're a Muslim, or you're a Hindu, you believe an entirely different set of things. And all of those things are matters of faith because there is no evidence for them. The only evidence we have is for the nature of the physical world. So the underlying kind of value or belief system that many people hold is that in a material world, spiritual things are unprovable and therefore have to be taken on faith. So we've separated out faith and evidence, faith and reason in many ways. You don't have to look very far down Twitter threads or comment threads on the internet to find people who want to refer to people of faith as people who just believe in the great sky fairy, something like that, because it's all unprovable, it's all unknowable. We have evidence for the physical world, but not for that which can't be kind of measured in a lab. And that is absolutely not the worldview, the Christian worldview, or the worldview of the Bible. The worldview of the Bible is that the spiritual and physical realities are layered over one another, and that there is evidence all around us within the physical world that points us towards the spiritual reality of who God is and of who Jesus is. I think one of the most powerful images you can think of is of the burning bush. The burning bush is just a bush on fire. Now, normally bushes on fire kind of eventually go out. And this one didn't go out, or didn't go out while Moses was watching it anyway. And so he went over to see what was going on. And yet in that physical event, that physical thing, the bush on fire, it kind of opened a doorway into the spiritual reality of the universe. And Moses, walks towards the bush that's on fire, just a physical thing, and yet suddenly finds himself in the presence of God. And that's a picture, I think, a wonderful picture of the biblical worldview, that physical and spiritual realities are overlaid and that there is evidence for the nature, the existence and the nature and the character of God all around us. And it's really important that we have some confidence in that, as we will see, because we will regularly get we will regularly get faced with people who think the opposite of that, who think, well, it's just something you believe, God bless you, there's no evidence for it. And so it's really important that we kind of get to grips in our minds and our hearts with what it means to encounter evidence. So this week we are looking at Luke chapter 7, and we're going to be looking at verses, just a short section, verses 18 to 23. It's part of a longer section you're very welcome to look at in terms of some interaction between John the Baptist and Jesus and onlookers. And one commentator sums it up really well. Because there are three questions in this passage. What does John think about Jesus? What does Jesus think about Jesus? And what does Jesus think about John? Those are all the kind of three questions, and it's written for people who are still, particularly for Jewish people in the first century, for whom John the Baptist was an incredibly important figure. So what John thought about Jesus really, really mattered, and it's written to kind of give an answer. It's in there. The account of this story is in there to kind of place who Jesus is within the context of John the Baptist's ministry, which was so important. But for us today, we're just going to focus on the first few verses, where we find John really asking some profound questions, about Jesus and about himself as well. So let's have a little read together, shall we? This is Luke 7, verse 18. John the Baptist, John the Baptist's disciples told him about all the things that Jesus was doing. Calling two of them, he sent them to the Lord to ask, "Are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else?" When the men came to Jesus, they said, "John the Baptist sent us to you to ask, 'Are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else?'" And as we looked at on Sunday, John the Baptist is having something of a crisis of confidence, a crisis of faith. In that relationship between faith and doubt that exists within all of us, doubt is kind of surging and faith is receding, and there are all sorts of good reasons for that. In John's life, he's in prison, he's been arrested, and we know he's not going to get out of prison. We know that shortly after this, there's going to be the incident with Herod and Herod's daughter, and John is going to be for the chop. And maybe John knows that. Maybe he senses that he doesn't have long left. And in the context of his lockdown, of his isolation, that his questions, his doubts are rising up. And he just begins to question what he has kind of spent his life on. And most of us, very few of us will get through life without a crisis of faith at some point, where doubt seems to surge in our lives and we kind of just question everything. A crisis of faith can happen for many reasons. Sometimes we can read something or hear something and it kind of completely changes our perspective on things. That's happened to me a couple of times. I read, I won't go into the details, but I read a really incredible book back, I think, probably about just over 20 years ago, and it kind of it kind of blew up my worldview for a bit. And for 24 hours or so, I wasn't quite sure why I was a Christian. I knew that I was a Christian. I didn't want to stop being a Christian, but I wasn't quite sure why I was a Christian. It was a very profound, very helpful experience. So sometimes we read something or we hear something and it kind of causes us to profoundly question what we've believed. But very often we go through a crisis of faith far more to do with our circumstances. Something happens to us, often something negative. It can be something positive. We can kind of, come into great wealth, or, suddenly find that everything is going great in our lives and we kind of don't know why we need God anymore. But very often we go through extended periods of hardship and difficulty. And in those times, it can sometimes feel alongside that the sense of God's presence can recede a little bit. And we kind of just start to wonder. We just start to question. So sometimes the questions are kind of intellectual questions of the mind. Very often they are questions of the heart. So the question, the thing we looked at on Sunday is, what do you do when you have a crisis of faith? Well, what John did when he had his crisis of faith was he looked to Jesus for his answers. As I said on Sunday, he leaned in to Jesus rather than pulling back. And honestly, I really think that is the best thing you can do when you are having a crisis of some kind. Some of us tend to withdraw in times like this. We kind of just pull away. We pull back from church, we pull back from other people, and then 6 months later we've kind of sacked the whole thing in, and everyone wonders what happened. But a crisis of faith is not unusual in a person's life. It's okay. Very few of us will get through life without a crisis of faith at some point. And yet the best thing we can do in moments like this is not to pull back, to pull away, but to lean into others, to that community of faith, to lean into practice, to kind of get back to those disciplines of prayer and reading that are so important to us. It may feel dry, it may feel as dry as a desert, but I promise you, stick at it. The seasons will change and the rain will come. So that's what John did. John leaned into Jesus. He sent to him with his question. And as we saw on Sunday, the question sounds a little bit kind of intellectual, theological. Are you the one who is to come? Or should we expect someone else? But it really isn't. It really is a cry of the heart. John in prison, whether he spent his life well, whether it was worth it for him to have spent his life on Jesus. Firstly, as the forerunner, announcing the one who was to come. And then, as it were, at the friend of the bridegroom. Here he is. Here is the one I said would come. And towards the end of his life, he questions it. He's like, is it you? And the question underneath the question is, have I wasted my life? Have I wasted my life? And there are so many things I love about Jesus' answer, but the first thing, before we get into the bulk of it, is that Jesus doesn't scold John for asking the question. And that's really important. Like, Jesus doesn't go, oh, you've got so little faith, what is wrong with you? Jesus, he doesn't scold us for coming to him, for leaning into him when we have questions. He doesn't scold us for that. He answers John. He answered John's question. He gave John an answer. He knew what John was going through, and he dealt with him with care and with gentleness. And that's really important for us to remember, that the Lord is not afraid of our questions. He doesn't mind when we kind of rock up going, when we are right in the midst of our crisis of confidence, crisis of faith. He deals with us gently in those times. Very often we feel like the onus is on us to believe more or try harder. But actually, we're often being too hard on ourselves. And actually, he wants to deal with us gently. Come to me with your questions. Bring them to me. And he would love to kind of offer us answers. But as we'll see, he offers a particular kind of answer to John's question. Sadly, it's easy for us to give people the wrong answer when they are having a crisis of faith. And the wrong answer is this: you just have to believe. You just have to believe. That's the wrong answer. And yet for many of us, we have that's the language that we've fallen into. When we feel like there is a kind of a crisis between faith and evidence, between faith and reality, the answer we give is, you just have to believe. That is not the answer that Jesus gave John. And very rarely, I think, does that answer satisfy. It's so important that we find better answers for people when they are having a crisis of faith. I think a great example is when our teenagers, when our young people are trying to form their worldview. One of the things they pick up quite quickly is the idea that there might be a conflict between faith and science. Sometimes they pick this up at school, sometimes they pick this up at church, because they are learning about science in school, and especially about the science of origins. And origins is a really important part of a person's worldview. And sometimes they might pick up in school that if you believe that the universe was created, you must somehow live in opposition to the idea, to some of the things that you learn in school, to the idea of evolution, or the idea that the universe is however many billion years old. And so very often they show up in church with questions, and it causes a little bit of a crisis for them, a kind of intellectual crisis, because they think, well, how do you kind of match these two together? And the question, and they will often ask, these young people often ask questions, well, how do you kind of reconcile these questions? But there is a question beneath those questions, just like there was for John. And the question is this, is Christianity intellectually credible? Is it intellectually credible? Or to be a Christian, do I have to kind of turn off a little bit of my brain? Am I going to have to zone out of my science lessons in school because I've been told I can't believe that? I can't engage with that. That's the question beneath the question. And very often the answer we give them is, oh, you just have to believe. Because we struggle to kind of integrate faith and science, or we've settled for the idea that the two can't be integrated. And so we tell them, oh, we don't really know how it works, you just have to believe.
I'm afraid at this point we have had something of a technical hitch, whereby I have plenty of video left of me talking through the rest of the Bible study, but I have no audio, which is a little bit frustrating. So what we're going to do for the rest of this Bible study is we'll watch some PowerPoint slides together, and I will talk us through the last 10 minutes or so of what we're going to be looking at this evening. So what answer did Jesus give John? If the answer wasn't, John, you just have to believe, what answer did Jesus give? Well, the passage tells us the answer that Jesus gave. Verse 21. At that very time, Jesus cured many who had diseases, illnesses, and evil spirits, and gave sight to many who were blind. So he replied to the messengers, "Go back and report to John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive sight. The lame walk. Those who have leprosy are cleansed. The deaf hear. The dead are raised. And the good news is proclaimed to the poor." The answer that Jesus gave John was, look at the evidence. Look at the evidence of what is happening in the world, happening around me. Look at the evidence, John, and therefore believe. Don't lose hope. Don't lose faith, because here, look at this evidence. Look at what is going on, what can be seen and touched and felt. And for me, that is just such an encouraging answer, that Jesus offered John evidence to help encourage his faith, rather than that simple answer of, oh, you just have to believe. And what was the evidence that Jesus offered John? Well, as we saw on Sunday, the evidence was of changed lives. Look at these people. Look how their lives are different. The blind can see, the lame can walk, those with leprosy are healed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is proclaimed to the poor. The evidence was evidence of changed lives. That was the evidence that Jesus offered John to encourage him and strengthen him in his crisis of faith. And that is still today, 2,000 years later, that is one of the most powerful, most compelling pieces of evidence that God offers the world that he is real and that everything that Jesus said about himself is true. The evidence of changed lives. Your story, my story, it's your story, of course it is. It's my story, but more than that, it is a piece of evidence that God offers the world that it's all really true. So here's the second question that you can think about as an individual in your household, or you can discuss with your home group, that you're part of. What difference has following Jesus made in your life? How is your life different? How is your life better than it was before? Now, for some of us, before might have been a long time ago. So we're going to have to do a little bit of excavation to bring that story out again. But it'd be great if we could, if perhaps just for a minute or two, you could practice telling the story of your changed life, the story of how your life has been changed for the better because you chose to follow Jesus. How has your life changed since becoming a Christian? It's quite a challenging thought for us, the idea that your life, my life, is offered by God as evidence for his existence and for the truth that Jesus really is who he says he is. It's quite challenging. And it's, of course, not just our testimony, our story, but it's actually the way that we live every day. We'll be looking at this a little bit after the summer when we get into the autumn, but the idea of being representatives and ambassadors of a better kingdom in this world is a really deep thread through the New Testament. So it's not just the story of our own experience of how we've been changed and what we've discovered for ourselves, but then obviously the way that we live, the kind of people that we are, is offered as evidence too. And that's something for us to deeply, reflect on in our conduct, in our character, in the way that we live our lives, in our community, in our workplaces, in our households. What kind of person am I? What message does my life give? I asked the question on Sunday, if someone were looking for evidence in your life that it's all true, would they find any? Would they find any? Do we practice our faith in the way that we live, in the way that we love, in the way that we lead? But I want to finish today with this evening with the final verse, the final quote from Jesus before the section kind of moves on to a more wider conversation, and it's this: at the end of his accounts back to John, Jesus finishes with these words. Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me. Now, these are strange words of Jesus, a little bit mysterious really, but as I've reflected on them over the years, I feel like they are some of the most human things that that we hear Jesus say. Some of the most empathetic words from the mouth of Jesus. It's almost as if Jesus seems to be saying, I know following me is tough sometimes. I know it's tough. And I know that sometimes he almost seems to be saying to us, following me makes your life more difficult and more complicated. You will have to make decisions differently. You will have to manage yourself, your finances, your family, your household. You will have to just kind of manage things. You get called to a higher standard. And sometimes you may look around at people around you and feel like the cost is higher and feels too high. And certainly to John, it's almost as if he's saying, I know, John, I know that I know what it's cost you to choose to allow your life to be the forerunner, to be the one who went ahead, to be the one who pointed towards me. It's almost as if in these moments he's saying to John, I know it's tough, but don't give up. Don't stumble. Keep going. And I think those are beautiful words for us. I think they are rich, deep words. So often, we feel like Jesus is just a follow me, try harder, do more, do better. And we can often feel like we don't quite kind of match up to his call. And yet here is the other side of that. Here is a moment of profound empathy where he seems to be saying to John at one of the most vulnerable moments in John's life, I know, John, if you just keep going, you'll be blessed. If you just keep going, you will be grateful. You will look back on your life from the other side and you will be so proud and so pleased that you didn't give up. And so for us in these difficult times, those words of Jesus are an extraordinary encouragement to us. I know it's been difficult to keep up with church at home sometimes. It's not like just showing up on a Sunday morning. It's very easy to feel disconnected and to feel to feel like giving up a little bit. And so I hope we take these words of Jesus as an encouragement, just to keep going. It would be very easy to kind of slip back into just watching Netflix and just kind of giving up on the cost and the commitment of following Jesus. So I hope we take these words to heart. Just keep going. Just keep going, because when you look back, you'll be glad you did. So here's the final question for you to have a think about or to discuss in your home groups. What does it mean and what has it meant for you to keep going at this time? Have you had to take on new spiritual disciplines? Have you had to, have you had to, go back to habits of Bible reading that perhaps had kind of given way a little bit, habits of personal prayer? Have you had to, is it just simply meant the decision to tune in to church at home, or to really choose to not kind of take those things for granted, but to lean in, as it were, as we said at the beginning? What does it mean for you in this time to keep going in your relationship with Jesus? Thank you so much for participating in our Tuesday night Bible study this week. I hope, again, you found it a rich time of digging in to the Gospel of Luke. I'm sorry it's been a little bit up and down in terms of the technology, but I hope there'll be plenty in this for all of us. In the meantime, God bless you. We will be gathering again on Sunday. We are just got 2 more weeks left of our Encounter series, and we'll look forward to being together as a community for Church at Home, 10 o'clock on Sunday morning.